You see, we have a strange relationship with time, especially in the spiritual sense. We treat it like it's infinite, like tomorrow will always be there. But what if it's not? What if July 27, 25 isn't just another date on the calendar, but a threshold, a line in the sand that once crossed? It changes everything for the chosen among us. Now, this isn't about superstition or fear-mongering. It's about accountability and, more importantly, awakening. For years, decades, even, we've lived under a kind of spiritual umbrella, a grace period, if you will. An era where God's mercy covered not just our ignorance, but our apathy. Where delayed obedience could still be forgiven, and half-hearted commitment could still yield spiritual crumbs. But grace, though boundless in its origin, is not endlessly measured in its administration. History tells us that every era of divine patience eventually shifts into a season of divine precision. Think of the flood or the fall of Jerusalem, or even the Reformation. There's always a before and an after. So what changes after July 27, 2025? The nature of grace itself. We shift from general mercy into refined justice. For the chosen, that doesn't mean abandonment, far from it. It means increased responsibility. Like a student who's been given all the tools, all the instruction, all the time, and now the exam is here. This is not punishment. It's maturation. It's the natural consequence of being called. When you're chosen, you're no longer allowed to remain comfortable. You're expected to stand, to discern, to lead. Not because easy, but because it's necessary. Psychologically, this parallels what happens in the life of any person who comes of age. There's a point where being Narvi stops being charming and starts becoming dangerous. A point where excuses lose their moral currency. And that's precisely where we are, collectively, spiritually, on the edge of that psychological shift. The chosen are no longer being coddled by heaven. They're being commissioned. And commissions come with cost. That's where the unease sets in, because the human sitch is wired for predictability. We want our lives to be stable, our beliefs unchallenged. But growth never happens in stasis. And divine timelines don't bend to human comfort. July 27 is a spiritual marker that signals the end of delay. It is the moment where "I'll change tomorrow" is no longer valid currency in the economy of heaven. Some will ignore it. They'll laugh, rationalize, or distract themselves with noise and novelty. But others, those who are attuned, who have been quietly watching the signs, will recognize it for what it is: a turning point. Not the end of the world, but the end of spiritual childhood. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the real question isn't, what will happen after July 27? It's, who will you be after July 27? Because what happens next isn't just about prophecy. It's about responsibility. There's something deeply unsettling, but also necessary, about the idea of separation. And I don't mean in the superficial sense of division or disagreement. I mean a psychological and spiritual separation. A clarifying line that distinguishes who people truly are from who they've claimed to be. After July 27, 2025, that kind of separation begins to accelerate. Not because God becomes less merciful, but because truth becomes more urgent. We need to understand this when crisis or transformation enters a system whether a society, a family, or even a church. The masks begin to fall. This is a principle that transcends religion. It's observable in history, in psychology, in literature. Stress reveals structure. And what we're about to see is precisely that, an unveiling of internal architecture. The chosen, those who have genuinely aligned themselves with truth, will become unmistakably distinct from those who have merely adopted the appearance of faith. Now, this doesn't mean the chosen are perfect. That's a way to look at it. It means they're rooted. There's an integrity there, a depth of conviction that doesn't sway when the winds of culture or fear blow through. They're not easily manipulated because they've paid the psychological price of forming an identity aligned with something greater than convenience or approval. That kind of person can endure, and they will be needed desperately. because the structures of false identity will start to collapse under their own weight. You've seen it already, haven't you? People who once stood boldly for their faith or principles now fold under pressure or adapt to trends without pause. That's not evolution. It's erosion. And what's dangerous is that, for a while, both the rooted and the hollow can look very much the same. But when testing comes, real testing, not just criticism or discomfort, what's internal becomes external. It always does. Philosophically, this is about the triumph of essence over image. The chosen will be defined by substance, not spectacle. They won't need to broadcast their allegiance to God. It will radiate from the way they speak, the way they sacrifice, the way they remain unshaken. And in contrast, many who once held platforms or influence will be revealed as actors in a role that no longer fits. The gap between these two types will grow, visibly, unavoidably. This will be difficult to watch. Some of the people we admire may fall. Some of our own assumptions may be challenged. But this isn't destruction. It's clarity. And clarity is a gift, though often a painful one. It allows us to make real choices, not illusions. It forces us to ask, what is actually animating my beliefs? Is it conviction, or is it fear of losing social comfort? This season will not tolerate ambiguity. Not because God is cruel, but because the time for pretending is over. What's authentic must rise. What's hollow must collapse. That's the law of reality. So when the line is drawn, and it will be, make sure you're standing on the side your soul can live with. Now, here's where things take an interesting turn. Because while much of this transition sounds heavy, even grim, it's not meant to crush the chosen. It's meant to empower them. After July 2025, we're not just talking about judgment or separation. We're talking about activation. A kind of spiritual awakening that goes beyond moral alignment and enters the realm of divine function. And this isn't speculative mysticism. It's a deeply psychological and archetypal reality. When false structures collapse, true purpose emerges. There's something that happens when a person finally sheds their dependency on external validation. When their sense of identity is no longer tethered to public opinion, social safety, or even institutional religion, what emerges in that space is a kind of raw, unsanitized courage. Not arrogance, but clarity. The chosen will begin to operate in a heightened state of internal coherence. Their thoughts, actions, and beliefs will line up, and when that happens, you unlock an entirely different level of human potential. And this is where spiritual empowerment begins to look tangible. Not in flashy theatrics, but in disciplined, supernatural function. Prophetic insight, healing, discernment, these aren't just theological ideas. They're byproducts of internal alignment with transcendent order. When your will is synchronized with truth, power flows through you, not for personal gain, but for the execution of purpose. The chosen are not being elevated to escape suffering, they're being equipped to confront it. That's the critical distinction. Think about it from a psychological perspective. In Jungian terms, when the ego dies to false identity, the archetype of the hero or the sage begins to emerge. The individual steps into their role not as someone entitled to influence, but as someone forged for responsibility. That's what's coming. A generation of individuals who are no longer seeking to be impressive, but necessary. And necessity is what makes a life meaningful, not success, not applause. Necessity. And let me say this clearly. This empowerment will not be democratic. It won't come to everyone equally. It will come to those who have been willing to endure the internal pruning required to carry it. Because power, especially spiritual power, is dangerous in untested hands. That's why so many who seek it never find it. They haven't built the container that can hold it without it breaking them. Or worse, corrupting them. The chosen are now being prepared not just to survive the collapse of the old systems, but to become architects of what comes next. They are not victims of the times. They are instruments shaped by them. That's a heavy thing to carry, but it's also deeply beautiful. So if you feel the stirrings of that calling, don't suppress it. Don't wait for permission. Align your life with truth, with discipline, with courage. Because after July 27, the world won't be asking for your opinion. It will be needing your presence. We need to be honest about something most people don't want to confront. Being chosen doesn't mean being shielded from suffering. In fact, in a paradox that's echoed through history, to be chosen is often to be targeted. Spiritually, psychologically, even socially, after July 27, 2025. Persecution won't just be an abstract possibility for the faithful. It will become a defining feature of their environment. And not in the theatrical sense we sometimes imagine, but in the subtle, disorienting, and often invisible ways that truth is resisted when it refuses to conform. It's not that persecution is new. It's embedded in every era where people have tried to live authentically in the face of systems that reward compromise. What's different now is that it will be more personal, more psychological, less about overt violence and more about erosion of credibility, of community, of perceived sanity. The chosen will find themselves increasingly at odds with the world's narratives, and that divergence won't be seen as principled. It will be framed as dangerous, even unloving. And that's where the test begins. Because the pressure to conform won't come through obvious force. It'll come through emotional manipulation, professional consequences, social exile, all designed to extract one thing: silence. Persecution in the modern context is deeply sophisticated. It doesn't always throw you in a prison cell. Sometimes it simply ensures you're excluded from influence. It starves your voice rather than breaking your bones. But the effect is the saming isolation, alienation, doubt. And if you haven't been fortified mentally, spiritually, philosophically, you will cave. Not because you're evil or weak, but because human beings are wired to avoid pain and seek connection. That instinct has to be disciplined by a higher loyalty, or it will betray your calling every single time. Now, here's the hard part. Some of this testing will come from inside the church, from people who mean well, from institutions that have grown soft, obsessed with comfort and consensus. The chosen will not only be rejected by the world, they may be misunderstood, even condemned, by other believers who can't see the larger picture.
That's not paranoia.
That's history. And it's part of what makes this season so psychologically intense. But here's where perspective changes. If you understand that persecution is not a failure, but a refining tool, it transforms the narrative. You stop asking, why me? And start asking, what is being forged in me through this? Pressure is what reveals structure, but it's also what creates resilience. You're not being broken. You're being tempered. The testing isn't about destruction. It's about preparation. The truth is, you can't carry power without pressure. You can't lead without rejection. And you can't be truly chosen without becoming a threat to something. That's the cost. But it's also the confirmation. So when the resistance comes, and it will, don't be surprised. Be ready. Because persecution in the life of the chosen is not a sign you've lost your way. It's often the clearest evidence that you've found it. At some point, we have to confront the reality that casual belief isn't going to hold. Not anymore. Not in the environment we're moving into after July 27, 25. This isn't about following a list of religious rules or checking moral boxes. It's about a level of internal transformation that demands everything. What's being required of the chosen now is something deeper, sharper, and far more difficult: radical obedience. And let's be clear, obedience is not the same as compliance. Compliance can be superficial. You can comply with authority and still harbor resentment or disconnection. Obedience, in its truest form, is the voluntary alignment of your will with something higher than yourself. It's not passive. It's intentional. And it demands a kind of psychological maturity that's increasingly rare in a world obsessed with personal freedom as the highest good. Radical obedience means acting in alignment with truth even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. It means saying yes to disciplines that hurt, to silence when you want to speak, to speaking when it would be safer to stay silent. It means structuring your life. Not just your Sundays, not just your speech, but your thoughts, your relationships around the voice of God. And that voice doesn't always tell you what you want to hear. We often romanticize spiritual experiences, but the actual life of obedience is profoundly uncomfortable. It's full of moments when the path forward is unclear, where the reward isn't immediate, where you feel alone in your convictions. But that discomfort is the soil where transformation happens. Philosophically, it mirrors the process of individuation in Jungian psychology, the painful, often disorienting journey of integrating your highest self. You have to die to the false layers you've built to survive. That death is not metaphorical. It's existential. And this is what separates the chosen from well-meaning. The well-meaning talk about faith. The chosen build their lives around it. They wrestle with Scripture, not just to be informed but changed. They obey when no one's watching. They don't just believe in holiness as a concept. They pursue it as a lifestyle. And that pursuit has consequences. It narrows your path. It limits your options. It sets you apart. But there's a paradox here worth sitting with. The more radically obedient you become, the more free you actually are. Not because life gets easier, but because your internal chaos starts to fall into order. You stop being a slave to external circumstances, to people's opinions, to the instability of your emotions. You become anchored, and in a world that's drifting culturally, spiritually, that kind of anchored presence is revolutionary. This is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness requires sacrifice. It demands that you trade your comfort for clarity, your passivity for purpose. That's the path ahead. So if you're waiting for things to get easier before you fully surrender, stop waiting. The time for partial commitment is over. In the days to come, only those who are radically obedient will remain standing. What we're ultimately being prepared for isn't just survival in a difficult world. It's participation in something much larger than ourselves, something cosmic in scale. After July 7 to 25, we're not merely navigating a cultural or spiritual shift, we're entering the final movements of a long, unfolding drama, the preparation for the final outpouring and the eventual return of Christ. And that requires more than belief. It requires deep alignment, precise action, and a mind fully engaged in the weight of what's at stake. From a psychological standpoint, most people live if their lives are disconnected from any grand narrative. They reduce their existence to comfort, distraction, and personal advancement. But the chosen don't have that luxury. They live with the uncomfortable awareness that history is not arbitrary. That every era, every crisis, every cultural rupture is part of a timeline heading somewhere, toward resolution, toward judgment, toward renewal. That awareness is a burden, but it's also a call to action. This next phase, post-July 27, is not just about what you endure, it's about what you build. The chosen are not passive observers of prophecy. They're participants in its fulfillment. Their job is not to escape the chaos, but to operate within it as agents of clarity, order, and redemption. And that's going to require extraordinary vision. Not in the mystical sense, but in the practical, functional sense. Vision that sees beyond the next paycheck or the next controversy, and into the architecture of eternity. When we talk about a final outpouring, we're not just referring to a surge in religious enthusiasm. We're talking about the release of divine power and insight for the explicit purpose of harvest, of calling in the last generation of souls before the end of the age. The chosen will not be spectators in this. They will be conduits. That's why everything before this, every pruning, every trial, every hidden season, has mattered. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared. But here's the crucial point: none of this happens by accident. You don't stumble into this kind of purpose. It's the result of intentional, disciplined living, of organizing your internal world, your beliefs, your emotions, your desires, around the reality that you were made for something far beyond personal peace. This is the highest form of meaning. And psychologically speaking, Meaning is what sustains people through suffering. It's what gives them strength when motivation fails. If you've ever felt that you were born in the wrong time, or that the world is too dark for your ideals, consider the alternative. Maybe you were born for exactly this moment. Maybe your discomfort is not a sign of misplacement, but a sign of assignment. Because what's coming isn't just an end, it's a beginning. A convergence of purpose, power, and presence that demands everything you have and gives more than you can imagine in return. So step forward, not with fear, but with focus. The time for hesitation has passed. The harvest is near, and your role in it is not optional. It's essential.